as Chantal just mentioned, my name is Trish McSweeney. I'm from Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in, well, Canada. First question I have for you. Who here is involved in their region, not the SWIFT people who are over there by the bar, but who here is involved in their region in ISO 20022? Just a show of hands. That's actually pretty good. That's probably about 70%. I'm not good at math, so I'm just guessing 70%. I actually can't see. As I said, my name is actually Patricia Marie McSweeney. I get Pat, Patty, Trish, Tish, Tush, Chris, Christ, and my personal favorite, which I have been called a number of times, Trash. I don't know who names their children Trash, but apparently that is the name that I get. I also get a few others, but that's... My point being, my name is 8 letters. I get 80 different variations. The reason why that occurs is because there's no common way to interpret my name. And that's just one person with one name out of the billions of people in the world and the number of corporations in the world who are trying to interpret data in a common way. Hence, we have ISO 20022 in a standard way, in a common language that we can all use to interpret data. So, here's my next question. Who here is from the United States? Hands up, I can't see. So that's not bad. You know, we've got a few people. I'm sure you're all interested in what's going on in the United States. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard Zina. I don't want to pronounce the D, who will tell you a little bit about what's going on in the States.
When we had our prep call for this session, we decided to proceed in order of least mature to most mature. The intent was with respect to ISO implementation, but it may also apply personally, so I go first. My moment of epiphany with respect to this particular subject occurred in Sibos, Dubai, when it was very clear that the conversation with respect to adoption had shifted from whether and if to adopt to how and when to adopt, with a focus on interoperability in transition. In other words, notwithstanding differences in implementation schemes and time horizons across jurisdictions, the global train was leaving the proverbial station. It was very clear from that discussion that in the wake of this momentum, no action on the part of US authorities was neither a sufficient nor a satisfactory response. So we started by doing what we do best: study it. In concert with our colleagues at the Clearinghouse, NACHA, and the accredited standards body X9, we engaged our colleagues at KPMG to conduct an assessment, assessing as dispassionately and as objectively as possible the existence or the absence of a business case for the US market. The scan consisted of 3 elements: a global scan in which we surveyed developments and experiences of other jurisdictions, a domestic scan, and also critically the impact of non-adoption, the so-called negative business case. So what did we find? First, with respect to the global scan, we confirmed that select jurisdictions, represented by several of my co-panelists today, are at different points on the trajectory to adoption. As to drivers, the 2 most cited global drivers, first was in response to regulatory mandate, and second, in conjunction with new infrastructure development or major platform upgrades. This is a key point of reflection for us in the United States. As many of you know, we are in the midst of a major modernization campaign of the wholesale services, consisting of both the Fedwire Fund Service and the Fedwire Securities Service, which will conclude in 2015. But that modernization effort is in legacy format, not ISO format. It is altogether conceivable that post-Fedwire modernization, we need to contemplate something that we might call Fedwire standardization. So far as the domestic scan is concerned, we identified four main conclusions. First, that the current demand for ISO largely resides among major global banks and major corporations, with most smaller institutions generally satisfied with the status quo. Second, that accepting market infrastructures, large banks, and global corporates, our domestic market is woefully ill-informed of ISO developments. Third, that the quest for a quantifiable and tangible business case for ISO remains elusive. The prospective benefits, however compelling, are generally on the horizon and not yet realized, with the costs perceived as more immediate and tangible. And finally, fourth, that the absence of an industry mandate will challenge US adoption efforts. As important as it has been to consider the positive business case for adoption, the assessment considered equally the negative business case, the case in effect of inaction. And I think those can be contemplated conceptually across three dimensions. First, the commercial dimension, the incremental cost to the United States of maintaining a payment system that does not seamlessly integrate with an emerging global standard. Second, the competitive dimension, especially if the prospective ISO benefits of efficiency, information-rich content, and innovation are realized globally, but not in the United States. And finally, the policy dimension, the risk of a US marketplace that becomes increasingly idiosyncratic with respect to payments, perhaps resulting in the denomination of more payments activity in currencies other than the US dollar, the migration of more activity to offshore dollar clearing platforms, and the general erosion of the dollar's status as a reserve currency. Serious questions for US policymakers on which to reflect. So how did KPMG distill its assessment in a portfolio of recommendations? Most significantly, while the ex-ante financial case was difficult to quantify, KPMG came to a judgment that there still may be strategic reasons to proceed, especially when the negative business case is factored into the calculus. As to specifics, KPMG concluded that while full adoption, canvassing cross-border and domestic and wholesale and retail may not be justified at this particular point in time, a more nuanced approach may represent a path forward consisting of the following elements. First, a concerted education campaign to develop a national strategy on ISO. Second, a recommendation to enable ISO for cross-border first, where the business case is most pronounced. And third, a reassessment of the domestic case for adoption, informed by ongoing global developments and our own experience with respect to cross-border implementation. And a supplementary recommendation, the use of ISO formats for all new product development. Now, we hosted a recent meeting of the CHIPS Business Committee and Fedwire's Wholesale Customer Advisory Group a few weeks ago to reflect upon the results of the assessment and the implementation plan that KPMG offered. It was a very rich conversation across multiple fronts. I would frame the three main takeaways from that session as follows. First, a strong expression of intent to move in a trajectory to adoption with the means of execution and the timetable still to be determined. Second, an imperative to engage others beyond global banks in U.S. planning efforts. And third, a preference not to distinguish between cross-border and domestic activity in implementation, perhaps in a coexistence model in transition. Just a final point in conclusion, or maybe two final points. The first being a caveat. Notwithstanding the expression of intent to move toward a path of ISO adoption, please do not mistake anything I've shared with an explicit roadmap in terms of means or timetable. Those judgments have yet to be made across the stakeholders or by our respective governance bodies. And finally, my remarks of necessity have been synoptic today and brief. But the U.S. stakeholder group, the Clearinghouse, the Federal Reserve, the NACHA, and X9 will be hosting a community session on Thursday afternoon in which we'll have a full hour to present the full results of the engagement and respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. See, Jeff is so anxious. He jumped up here already, and he never gave me the opportunity to get people to put their red caps on if they were from Canada. So,
Still do that.
over to you, Jeff.
Well, no, we can still do the red cap thing. How many Canadians here can put on your red caps? Great. Thank you. Okay. So I guess we are in the category of growing adopters when I look at the three categories that Richard talked about. We have three main drivers for our ISO 20022 initiative in Canada. The first one, and probably the most important one for Canada, is enhanced remittance information. If you look at our current messaging standards that we use in Canada, they are lacking remittance data and really are preventing us from getting to that next phase of straight-through processing and automated reconciliation. So that's a key objective for us as far as ISO goes. The next is domestic and global interoperability. I think it's pretty obvious to everyone here what the benefit of international or global interoperability. But domestically for Canada, it's important because, again, our current standards are quite dated. And so over time, the direct clears in Canada have found ways to use our standards in a proprietary way. So basically, they're not very standard anymore. And as a result, there's a lot of additional processing that takes place to be able to make a transaction go all the way from the debtor to the creditor, and it's just not very efficient. And then lastly, we want to get to a single global standard. Today, the CPA systems in Canada clear and settle based on three different standards, and again, that's not very efficient. In terms of our project got underway. We're taking a two-phased approach, and phase one got underway in March of 2013. And it's fundamentally focused on developing the messages, and it's basically a mapping exercise. So it's taking the three existing message standards that we have today, mapping them to ISO 20022, and then adding in the additional remittance data. I like to think that we're taking a fairly bold approach when it comes to remittance data. We have defined already in our messages a fairly robust set of remittance data based on the ISO 20022 standard, and we will be supporting both structured and unstructured information. In addition to building out the messages, we've been working on the various policy considerations and CPA rules that will go along with the messages. And another key deliverable in phase one is developing an industry adoption strategy. And as part of that strategy, we've just started to embark upon doing a high-level cost estimate for the industry as well. So phase one is on target to wrap up in February of 2015. So we're well into phase one and have that, it's going well. Phase two will be the execution of our adoption strategy. And that's a work in progress, so I can't give you a lot of details on that right now, but I can share with you some key themes. We are going to take a phased approach by scheme, and we're going to start with retail payments, debit and credit. And the main reason for that is, if you look at our retail payments in Canada, they are lacking remittance data the most. So we want to realize that benefit sooner than later. So that's why we've scheduled retail payments to go first. We are taking what's referred to as a brownfield approach to implementing ISO 20022. So there's brownfield and greenfield. Greenfield is if you are building out a brand new system and you incorporate the ISO 20022 messaging as part of your new system development. We're taking a brownfield approach. So our direct clearers in Canada will have to or need to go in and change their systems to use the new ISO 20022 messaging standard, and we will migrate away from existing standards. We're looking to do that over a fixed period of time. We haven't quite landed on the time frame yet, but the guidance we're receiving is that shorter is better than longer, because I don't think anyone really wants to live in this world of coexistence for too long, because again, that's sort of added expense and overhead. As well, we are looking at incentives and penalties, because for this to work, everybody has to get over to the new standard by a certain point in time. And lastly, the role of the CPA will be to champion and support the adoption of ISO 20022 in Canada. And in addition, we will be the caretaker or the custodian for the standard as well. So just quickly, challenges and opportunities. When it comes to ISO 20022, there are a lot. I've only selected 3. First one is communication. Communication is just absolutely critical. You really can't get out and talk enough about ISO 20022, whether it's to the financial services organizations, whether it's to your corporate stakeholders. We found in phase 1, we sort of allotted a certain amount of time for outreach and budget. About halfway through phase 1, we went back to our board of directors and asked for more money and more time to do more outreach. And it really was a good decision, and I think it's helped us quite a bit. Next one is respecting boundaries between the collaborative and competitive space. The CPA plays in the collaborative space, and we need to be careful that as we develop these messages and the rules that go along with it, that we don't infringe upon the competitive space of our members. So it's something, it's not really clear when you're crossing that line, so you just have to be careful that you don't cross that line. And then lastly, ensuring that you're aligned with other international standards so that down the road, we will have a good, efficient cross-border type system. And that's it.
Thank you. And you know how to work the clicker. So, of course, you're kind of getting into the routine now. I have to ask the question, who here is from Australia? Who here would like to be from Australia? Because they're just going into spring right now. We're going into winter. Oh, there's a few people. It's a long way to come. But on that note, I'd like to introduce Chris Hamilton, who will give us an idea of what's going on with IC Space. I don't call it that personally, and Australia. I call it IC Space.
Thank you, Trish. Okay, so what you've just heard, as I think Jeff said, a couple of brownfield type implementations. Really hard, lots of people don't see the point, lots of debate about whether ISO 20022 and why ISO 20022 and how ISO 20022 and all that sort of stuff, really sounding quite tricky and difficult. In Australia, we're doing a species of greenfields implementation. What that means is we're leaving our existing systems alone. And instead, we are at a critical stage where, touch wood, cross myself, we're going to be building a new system. We're about 2 years into the detailed work to identify the proposal, cost it, time it, plan it, design it, and all that sort of stuff to get going. A new type of real-time payment system. So it's not my function today to talk about that system, but that's where we're using ISO 20022, right? I think it's probably fair to say, and I stand to be corrected by a couple of people in the audience who have been very closely involved in this, that nearly every aspect of that system has been vociferously debated and argued about amongst the Australian payments community, because it's a very bottom-up, grassroots type of development, except whether we should use ISO 20022. That is the one thing that has been an element of the proposition from day one and has not changed and has never come in for serious debate. Would that be fair? I don't think anyone's ever said, why are we using ISO 20022, right? So we're 2 years into a program, and that hasn't happened. So how we got there, and I think there's probably a few things one could say about why that's the case. First, obviously, it's greenfields. And so you can turn this around and say, if you were going to build a brand new payment system today, why would you not make it ISO 20022? You hear so much about it. It's clearly the emerging global standard. And therefore, if you have the opportunity to design from the ground up, and isn't that great when you get that opportunity, why wouldn't you go that way? Okay, so that's the first thing. But there's actually more to it than that. We started talking about ISO 20022 a long time ago, so we took a very incremental approach to this. There was a document published by the Australian Payments Clearing Association, which is the industry sort of self-regulatory body and association, in 2008, following about a year's worth of work by member organisations, banks, building societies, credit unions, etc., on the direction of low-value payments in Australia, the so-called low-value payments roadmap. Now, that document, I'm sad to say, pretty much sank without trace. It got very little attention indeed, but it was our attempt at a bit of thought leadership. And one of the things it said was, you know what, this ISO 2002 stuff is quite good and we should have a good look at it. Now back in 2008, that was a bit more of a gamble than it is today, frankly. And I think there was quite a lot of discussion at that time about whether that was a good thing to talk about. But nevertheless, we put it into that paper as a recommendation. And then we did a couple of other things. We did a gap analysis to say, if we were to adopt ISO 2002, not that we will, but if we were to, how different would that be from existing low-value payments in Australia? And then we sat down and did a schema where we actually got a group of bankers together and got them to map out what the thing looks like. And that scheme has never been used, and it was never mandated and never forced. But what it did do was provide a sort of ongoing education program on ISO 20022. So people who perhaps hadn't had much exposure got to know a lot more about it. The financial institutions that were sort of ahead and behind tended to equalise a little bit. And indeed, then individuals became champions back in their own organisations. So that when the CEO back in the bank is talking to techos about whether this ISO 2002 thing makes sense, the techo's already been thinking about it and talking about it amongst his own technical community and has a good, strong response to that. And that's a really important part of the overall process. So we took a very incremental sort of approach. Now, having got to this stage of making it part of the water supply, if you like, the real critical question was, do we need a new payment system? So it's not about what the standard can, what you can do to advance the standard. It's about what the standard can do for you when you have a need for a new payment system. So the new payments platform, which is the new piece of work we're doing now, is based on ISO 22 because it's become part of the way we think about new payments infrastructure in Australia. I want to use another couple of minutes, thank you, just to talk about another piece of research that you might find interesting and useful if you're into this space, which is a piece of work by the International Council of Payment Association Chief Executives. Terrible name. Not my choice, but there we go. Which is just a group of us who meet every year and talk about payments issues from a payments market infrastructure sort of perspective. Lippis Advisors did some work for us that's only just been published a week ago on ISO 20022 adoption. It's got some interesting case studies. It's got the Australian case study, but it's got a number of other ones in there as well. And you can find it on our websites, on any of the websites of the organisations involved. So apca.com.au is mine if you're interested, but the UK Payments Council, NACHA, Canada, Ireland, I can't remember who else now. Yeah, anyway, so it should be pretty easy to find, and it might be a useful piece of input. But just running you quickly through what's in there, some case studies from different parts of the world on what they've done. There's a combination of greenfields and brownfields type implementations there. This is a little bit hard to see, but so get the piece of paper. But this is based on responses to say, what were the big advantages of ISO 22 and what were the disadvantages that people worried about. It won't shock any of you to realise that global interoperability and the richness of the data is important here. Now, just pausing for a second, for us, ISO 22 was always about rich data. So the reason why it was so much part of the thinking was we want this new payment system to enable a whole lot of automation that can't currently be done, and for that you need data. So that's where the big driver in Australia was. Just looking at the disadvantages very quickly, difficult to build a business case. No doubt that's absolutely true, particularly in a brownfields environment. But in a way, I think a business case for a standard is going to be a very, very hard thing to do anyway. You might want to do a business case for a fantastic new payment system that's going to deliver lots of value, and by the way, it's built in ISO 20022. But it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say a business case for a standard as such. You need to be looking at the benefits. So for us, anyway, it was about focusing on the longer-term strategy and bringing people along incrementally rather than being really focused on a business case. Obviously, greenfields is kind of easier than brownfields because you're getting commitment around the potentiality of the new system. We did a lot of generic work on how it might look and what the practical benefits might be to try and isolate some of those exciting new benefits that you could gather from a new system. And you absolutely do need to stay in the community, talk to people at events like this, understand what's happening in other places and stay very close to that. So I hope that's been useful in terms of people thinking about ISO implementations. That's probably enough from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Don't walk away with the clicker. Thank you. So, another question, of course. Who is here from Europe? That's a lot of people. A lot of interest. That's probably because you guys already have a lot of the experience that the rest of us are looking for. But with that, I'll turn it over to Sylvain Debeaumont from the ECB.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. That's indeed a challenge to speak last because most of the relevant statements have already been made. I take up the challenge, though. I put together 4 to 5 slides, actually pictures you'll see. Well, yeah, here they are. To illustrate a bit what has been our approach in Europe for adopting the ISO standards to large value payments in Europe. Starting with the drivers. Why do we want to move to ISO standards? Because we want to increase the efficiency of the banking sector as a whole. Because we believe that the interoperability and the reusability of the standards which offers ISO 20022 would contribute to that. Because we think that it's fully in line with the strategy that has been elaborated more than a decade ago by the EU head of states in Lisbon, and that's about the first picture. That's fully in line with this to make the European Union a place for innovation and a place for efficiency. And also, we think that there is a strong element of coherence in this approach to do the same for high value payment as what we did for the other segments of the payment and settlement activities. In Europe, as you know, we have adopted, we are heavily relying on ISO standards for the retail segment, so to say, with the SEPA, and very soon with the start of T2S as well for the securities settlement. Now some words about the challenges. The first challenge for us is that we're not speaking about a greenfield implementation. We are a system that is already in production for more than 7 years. We are a system that is having a very high number of participants. We have about more than 1,000 direct participants. We are connecting throughout the world about 50,000 banks which are reachable via Target 2, which means more than half of the BICs that SWIFT has registered. We have a high heterogeneity within these participants or stakeholders. We have very high heterogeneity in terms of their expectation, in terms of their business case, in terms of their ability to move quickly. We also have observed that not all our banks knew so much about ISO 20022. The biggest one, they know about ISO. The other ones, they have heard about ISO 20022, but not necessarily, let's say, up to a point that they can really see what are all the implications of an adoption of these standards. And precisely for those banks that have already an idea of what it would mean to adopt the ISO standards, Another difficulty we have been confronted to is the fact that for them, they could see very clearly, very quickly, and very concretely in terms of cost, what it would represent. How much do I have to put on the table? How much do I have to ask my management to budget for next year or for the years to come? While I have to say that the real benefits, that was a bit more difficult for them to grasp really that reality, to substantiate them, and on top of that, we would only be speaking about benefits in many years from now. But I would say that on top of that, what added to the difficulty is that when we started the discussions with our banks, and that was about in 2010, that was a period where the banks were still heavily hit by the financial crisis, while they were also quite busy with preparing themselves for SEPA, preparing themselves for Target 2 securities, and on top of that, the increasing pressures from the regulators. But the biggest fear that we have observed on the side of the bank was the fear of the multiplicity of the standards. Our banks, what they said to us was, we don't want to use a particular type of standard to send the payments to target, and then another set of standards, still in ISO, but another variant, so to say, for sending my payments to the TGS in the US, in Canada, or wherever. And beyond this diversity, this geographical diversity of the standards, which is a risk, they didn't want that for their business case, even in Europe, when they are receiving instructions from their clients, in the context of correspondent banking, they didn't want that the standards that they have and they are currently using, I mean, FIN in that case, for correspondent banking, becomes incompatible with the new standards, with the new ISO standards that we had in mind to develop. So to take an image, and that's about this picture, they didn't want somehow that it breaks the logic of the end-to-end automation. They didn't want that, like a bit the passengers in a train that want to cross the border, and because the distance between the rails on the one side of the border and the other one, they are different, that the passengers have to leave the train and take another one. They didn't want to make any type of truncation in the information they were getting from correspondent banking, or to add some extra information they didn't have to comply with the standards before they are submitting them to the RTGS system. Now, the approach. What has been the approach that we have jointly elaborated with our banks? We had many discussions, many rounds, many consultations, and the good thing is that our top banks, our bigger banks in Target 2, it happened that they are as well the shareholders and the biggest bank in the other system that we have in the EU, in the other large value system, namely Euro 1. And that helped a lot, let's say, to invent, or let's say to work on a strategy that was not only for our system, but also for the Euro 1 system, so that at the end we were working on a strategy, on an approach for all the large value payments in euro in Europe. So that has helped a lot. Concretely, what we have agreed on with the users and with the Euro 1 operator was to move from November 2017 onwards, to move and to work exclusively with MX messages. We would forget about the empty messages which we are using today on FIN, and in November 17, in a big bang, we would only use the MX equivalent. Now, which MX equivalent are we using? We benefited from the work that SWIFT standards had carried out, speaking with the operator of the most important market infrastructures in the world, payment market infrastructures in the world, and the so-called high-value payment standards, HVP. So that's precisely the subset of standards that we are going to use in Europe and that we hope will be also adopted by the other TGS in the world. The beauty of this set of standards, if I may say, is that they are using a like-for-like approach. That means that there is a full compatibility, a backward compatibility with the legacy standard, with the MT standards, and that's not at all breaking the chain of correspondent banking for our banks. But of course, what we have saying to our banks is that we don't want that November 2017 is an end in itself. Things will not be stopping in November 2017. We consider that as part of our strategy for adopting ISO standards, there are still some further steps to achieve. We want to stand ready for further enriching our standards. Like for like is just a step from which afterwards we can consider enriching the standards and really reap all the benefits of ISO. So that's a bit the idea of this bridge. We don't want to be in this situation where we make a lot of work, but we just stop in the middle of the river and we are not yet reaching the bank on the other side. And now, very quickly, the lesson. What do we draw as a lesson? I would say that it was difficult for us to convince the banks and to convince all the stakeholders and participants to convince them to move without having a precise and concrete business case to show to them. The business case is still to come, definitely. And on top of that, our banks were a bit suspicious that why should we be the first or among the first to move? Why not waiting that other ATGS in the world have already moved? And for us, what we try to tell to them, and apparently we have convinced them because there is a strong support by the industry in Europe for our migration to ISO, is that before the business case, we have to set the strategy. And we shall not wait that the business case is really there to do the work and to adapt the ISO standards to our system. We, as operator of market infrastructures, we are facing a very big time inertia. It takes years to adopt, to make such a big revolution and to adopt ISO standards. It will take us, just speaking about the implementation, between 3 and 4 years to adopt the ISO standards. So we are a bit like this oil tanker on the ocean. We need to anticipate. We need to look in the crystal ball. We cannot wait that the business case is there, otherwise it's too late. The same way the captain of this ship, if it starts seeing a reef through the window of its cabin, it's already too late. You need to anticipate largely enough, the same way we need to anticipate the needs of our clients several years in advance. And that's about it.
Yeah. Thank you, Sylvain. So we are running a little bit late, but that's okay. Because now I have these 4 gentlemen on the couch, and I can begin to grill them. So I have a question first for the audience. With respect to the primary challenge facing ISO 20022 and migrating to ISO 20022, kind of what Sylvain was just talking about, who thinks that this is a bit of a challenge? Who thinks that migrating to ISO 20022 is not something you're going to do overnight? It's not something that you're going to, you have to get a lot of stakeholders involved. Who thinks that's a bit of a challenge?
Yeah.
Surprisingly, 20% of you don't think it's a challenge at all. I would have thought it was 1% don't think it's a challenge, because it is a very big challenge. And I think that's the one thing that everybody here has acknowledged. Whether you're in planning, kind of starting to plan for implementation, you definitely have some dates, or you're actually implemented already, it is a big challenge. And I kind of like to hear from you all. Where do you think we should focus with respect to that challenge? So maybe, Richard, you can talk to the studies that you've done and what's the one thing that we need to focus on from a challenge perspective?
I'll suggest with any network effect, to realize the ultimate value, all the players need to move together in unison. And I think that is among the greatest challenges that we face, getting financial institutions, corporates, vendors, all moving toward a common objective, or else this network value that we desire through ISO will be a network fantasy. So I'll suggest that that's the greatest challenge that we face.
Yeah. And Chris, what about you? What do you think success looks like after we've overcome that challenge?
So I think, and I agree that the coordination is incredibly important. And I think the way to harness that is to get a very clear sense of what your benefits from whatever the work you're doing is. So I always get a bit nervous about people talking about the need to implement a standard. The standard's always going to be a means to an end of some kind. So it's really important to get clear in our heads what is the benefit we're looking for. And you've seen 4 quite different examples here of different systems aiming to do different things. Sometimes it's a conversion or an upgrade, if you like, of the capability of the existing system. Sometimes it's a new system. The really important thing is to focus on those benefits, because ultimately the community is going to move when there is a critical mass of players who say, yeah, I can see how I can make a better service for my customers, potentially make some money from a service that they're going to be prepared to pay high prices for. Those kind of things are actually quite important and can't be ignored. I realise that's where the business case part of it comes along, but the business case is going to sit with the participants and getting them to say, yeah, I can see this is why this is good for me, right?
So it's kind of like you gotta do the study, you gotta have that information, and then implementing the standard isn't necessarily an end to itself. It's you have to give people the tools to develop those business cases to move forward.
So for us, the ISO conversation is really a conversation about flexible, rich data in your payment message, because you can then do a whole lot of automation with it. So it's about the means to the end.
And I think, Jeff, that you kind of touched upon that, the competitive versus collaborative space. We've had a lot of discussion. I know from a Canada perspective, we continually say competitive versus collaborative. But how did you kind of come up with, in the competitive collaborative, the adoption strategy that you have come up with? How did that what are the challenges with respect to adoption?
Well, I think the key challenge for us in arriving at an adoption strategy is ensuring that all interests were represented in the strategy. So we've got stakeholders, we have direct clears, we have the CPA. So we had to look at competitive, we had to look at collaborative requirements, and come up with an approach that was sensitive to all of those different areas. And in addition to that, even your timeline for adoption, I know in some jurisdictions, ISO 20022 has been mandated as a regulatory requirement, and just a time put out there saying it must be done by such and such a time. And that doesn't really maybe allow you enough time to realize the outcome that you really want to get. So I think the approach we're taking of getting input from all, coming up with a timeline that's going to work for everyone, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah. And Sylvain, with respect to adoption in Europe, how did that come about? Was it simply thou shalt, mandate, or was it more of a conversation, discussion, and then the adoption made sense?
Well, let's say that's always the spirit with which we have worked with our banks in the context of Target 2, and in Europe in general with our market infrastructure. We are there to serve them. So, of course, we give a lot of emphasis and importance on the dialogue with our participants to try to catch to get their feedback, to take into account as well the high diversity of profile of the banks, different needs. But I have to say that there was really in the discussion on ISO relatively quickly a kind of converging interest that we could identify, and that has led us to that decision to move. And that has obviously helped the decision making.
And I think following on from that, you also have, kind of that message around don't let the railroad come into one space and everybody's got to get off and go into another. And I think collectively that's very important, because
Absolutely.
From a market infrastructure point of view, I mean, my customers wouldn't want to say, well, I can send to Australia and everything's fine, but I send to Europe and all of a sudden things stop and, I'm falling off the end of the dock, or I'm driving the ship into God knows where type of thing.
I think that less than ever we cannot consider that we are on an island. We are definitely speaking to the same banks. I mean, the 4 of us, most presumably our top participants are the same, or there is certainly a very high overlap. So we have also to address this concern that they want to limit their cost, make their life easy using one single set of standards as much as possible.
I like the idea of making my life easy. That really appeals to me, to tell you the truth. I do want to open the floor up to questions, but before we do, I think we have a special speaker here from India, Vijay Chugh, as I say his name is. I hope I've said it correctly. And want to get the perspective from India, who has recently implemented ISO 20022, and some perspective around what you've heard collaboration, gosh, that's a big word for me. Collaboration, adoption, kind of what other things should we consider? And we'll get you a microphone.
Thank you very much. We've just implemented, but our exposure to 2022 began almost in 2008 or 9. We were implementing the core banking solution for the Reserve Bank of India, and we needed to set up a standard. The primary thought was to get into some ISO level processes. So we implemented the ISO 22 on the Reserve Bank's core banking solution, which actually brought on a single GL all government accounts, all commercial bank accounts, and public debt onto a single GL. So that was in 2010-11. When we were implementing the RTGS, the new RTGS, because the old RTGS system was not doing too well in handling the rising volumes, then the thought process came to us, why not go in for the ISO 22 on the RTGS system also? So, because it would seamlessly blend into the core banking solution. So, CBS actually offers a backup plan on a different system just in case RTGS collapses. So, it can move seamlessly into that system. So, while we were debating at that point of time what really constitutes a golden copy, even if you have a backup for an RTGS system, we thought this would sort of work seamlessly across both the systems in place. Yeah. So the problems which we faced were almost what you are facing in terms of getting all the stakeholders together. But the study that we did was not as major as what US has done. Going forward and learning from our experience, we feel any study actually looks at clear and present danger. It doesn't really foresee the future benefits to the extent that you can really quantify today and say that this is what it's going to be. But having said that, we did a little bit of bench test marking, and we found the ISO was very versatile. And even though extremely intimidating to see such a large formatted message compared to the earlier ones, and the kind of bandwidth and storage requirements for the benchmarking showed that it really does faster processing. So that was, once that was clearly established, we said this is the way forward. Then getting all the stakeholders in. So we gave them a timeline, we gave them a free converter tool which they could sort of utilize, and we gave them almost a year's time. But it was good to know that the banks were very keen to convert, and within 6 months all the banks are on the ISO 20 or 22 platform. So it's moved seamlessly. We were very happy with it. It handles extremely large volumes. And we're sort of geared for handling billions of transactions. So that's how it's going to go.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm a little bit scared now because you told Jeff that it's 6 months, and we've been arguing 5 years in Canada. So I do want to open the floor up to any questions that people might have.
All of India? Really?
Wow.
Are you shocked?
I am. I'm impressed and shocked. Well done.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions?
Trish, just to make an observation, if
Sorry,
I may.
I didn't know where that voice was coming from.
I'm over here. I think that really nicely encapsulated the complex interplay of incentives that you need with these kind of big structural changes. You know, it's never one thing or the other. It's never all a regulatory club. It's never carrots of commercial incentive. And there's usually some facilitation in there somewhere, some things that make it simple, make it easy, all that sort of stuff. It's some complex mix of that. And the more you can think through the interplay of those different drivers on the financial institutions, I think the better you're going to
and that's a very consistent message that I've been hearing from everybody and hearing, thus far is collaboration. It's absolutely essential in the communication and making sure everybody gets their chance to input.
Yep.
But is there another question?
Hi. I just want to ask, is it true that the methodology is always making sure it is backward compatible, or else then whoever are more advanced on this ISO 20022 will be even put in a more disadvantage that they cannot do business with the people who hasn't been converted?
Right. Backwards compatibility.
But I mean, as far as we were concerned, because of the fear that I had explained from our banks, we go for like for like. So we per construction of the standard, I would say, and that has been developed, as I was saying, jointly with the SWIFT standard. So we know that all what you are transporting today in the legacy standards, MT standards, will find a place in the new standards that we will be using, and vice versa. So there is a full backward compatibility. Now, as I said, it's not the end. At a certain stage, when we are all there, when we have reached the critical mass, when most of the world has gone in this direction, then will come a point where we have to think of really getting the benefits, the business benefits of the ISO standards, and to start using this very high potential of enriching the messages. But that is something where, as operator, we will not, let's say, dictate the pace. This will have to be, the priorities and the pace will have to come from our users, i.e. the banks.
Yeah. And I think that's how we say it in Canada is the competitive, collaborative. What we're doing from a market infrastructure point of view is making sure that the tools are there, the tool being ISO 20022. If I, as an FI, want to take advantage of that because I have a client base that allows me to do that and wants me to do that, that's my choice. Yeah, that's exactly.
Although I guess there's the risk factor, the thing you've got to worry about there, and this may be where you're coming from, is what's happened in Japan with the Zengen system, where they've upgraded the architecture and allowed an alternative of the existing messaging architecture or an ISO compliant messaging architecture, and indeed the take up as a consequence has been quite low. People have kept doing what they have done historically and haven't seen the logic of the investment to move to the other one. So I mean, that's a challenge you've got to manage here, and I think, again, creating the opportunity for the exciting new products that can be done, which you can't do on the old system, is where to go with that, but that might challenge your backwards compatibility.
Yeah,
right?
and that's exactly kind of what I heard Richard say with respect to the study that they've done in terms of they don't want to live in an island world from a U.S. perspective, saying the U.S. is going with this standard when everybody else is going this way. It kind of creates that disconnect, that stopped rail train, as we talked about previously.
I mean, we have very clear direction from our members and our stakeholders that it's like for like plus enhanced remittance data. So we need to have that enhanced remittance data, and we'll allow a period of time yet to be determined, but it'll be like 3, 4, 5 years, something like that. Both will coexist, so you'll have backwards compatibility. But at the end of that period, it will be mandated through the CPA rule set, and everyone will move forward with ISO 20022. So you can go either way. It kind of depends on the requirements, I think, of your country.
In Jeff's opening remark, you also referenced pricing as a scheme perhaps to encourage adoption as well. So that's another lever at our disposal.
Yeah.
We've been saying penalties and incentives, and I've said no more penalties, disincentives and incentives. That's the way we're going with it. Any other questions that we have from the audience? We've kind of ISO 20022'd you to death.
Too much standard is never enough.
Too much standard is never enough. Is that what you said?
That's what I said.
Anything further? No other questions? Then I will thank you very much. It's been a most interesting hour. Thank you for your efforts. Okay.